Okay, let's talk about how oxygenated blood flows to the arms and gives up its oxygen gas and nutrients, picks up its CO2 and waste, and then winds up returning to the heart. That will be the subject of this particular video. All right, so let's think about this now. Over here on, we have our heart over here, as you guys know. This is kind of a little bit of an angled view of the heart that we're taking a look at. But over here, of course, is your left ventricle. The left ventricle, I want to change pen colors here for a second. The left ventricle is going to pump blood up into the aorta. That first part of the aorta is called the ascending aorta because it's traveling upward. Blood is moving upward in that way. Now, if you look carefully at our diagram here, there are 1, 2, 3 exits off of the arching part of the aorta. That's called the aortic arch where this is taking place. All right, so if we're going over to if we have our oxygenated blood and our little blood drop we're thinking about is going to wind up heading over toward the right arm, it's going to have to take this exit off of the aortic arch right in there, that one that I'm highlighting. That is called the brachiocephalic artery. Okay, brachiocephalic, what does that let you know about where blood flowing through that artery is headed? If you think about back to your body region terms, you guys learned in Biology 201, brachial refers to the upper arm over here. Cephalic is a term that can refer to the head. So that's where that artery got its name. The blood is flowing in that direction. All right, so if we have blood flowing through that brachiocephalic artery, if you guys look really closely, that artery splits into 2 major branches. And again, we're just going to focus in on the major blood vessels as part of these exercises. All right, this one that's flowing upward toward the head is called the right common carotid artery. So that's one of those major arteries you guys need to know. You guys have heard of your carotid artery before, and that it's passing through the neck. So that's bringing blood up, to a good deal of the neck and also up toward the head as well. The reason it's called the common carotid artery is it's actually going to split into 2 branches up in the head area, which we'll talk about later. That's one way a blood drop could go. The other way is that it could head this way through this artery, and that is called your right subclavian artery. Sub is referring to like underneath or below. Clavian, guess what that's referring to? Your clavicles. So that's where it got its name. So a lot of these arteries use regional terms that you guys have already learned. So they're not too hard to remember these terms once you start practicing with them a little bit. All right, so blood that is passing through the right subclavian artery is going to be heading off in that direction. Now over on the left side, I'm going to erase all of that. On the left side, things are a little bit different. This is something you have to remember about the left side. There is no brachiocephalic artery over on the left-hand side, so keep that in mind. Blood that travels through the aortic arch and is headed over to the left side of the body has a couple of options. One is that it will exit off here and start heading up toward the neck and the head over on the left side. That artery is called the left common carotid artery. So the left common carotid just branches directly off of the aortic arch. There is no brachiocephalic artery over on that side. Okay, that's one possibility. The other one is that a blood drop will go this way. That large artery that you see right in there, I didn't quite get my line up on the artery. That is your left subclavian artery. Okay, and that's going to carry blood, across the shoulder and then down into the left arm. That's the possibility on that side. Finally, there is a third possibility over here on this side, and that is if a blood drop didn't happen to exit through any of those 3 arteries we just talked about, then it's going to continue on through the descending aorta. Okay, Now, if you look closely at a diagram like this, you see all over the place there are arteries that are branching off of these larger ones that we're talking about. So an imaginary blood drop will randomly exit into some of these different veins to go to particular body locations. And we're not going to get into the identities of all these little side streets that you see here. We're just going to be concerned with the major ones. And I'm sure that crushes you greatly, that you don't have to learn the identities of all of these different minor arteries. Well, they're not all, even all minor ones. I know you're devastated. Okay. So let's think about going on to the arms. We'll have a separate video clip where we talk about blood that's flowing up along the neck toward the head to supply important things like the brain, kind of important. All right, so if blood is going to the arms, then it's going to pass through the subclavian artery, depending on which side we're talking about. All right, subclavian artery. Arteries change names, so keep that in mind. You know how annoying it is when you're driving along a road and the street name changes? You know, some cities are notoriously bad for that. Sometimes street names change multiple times, and that is what happens with these large arteries as they pass into different regions. Okay, so the subclavian arteries on either side become the axillary arteries. It's another artery name you guys need to know. Around an axillary, if you guys remember, that's the regional name for the armpits. The axillary artery then becomes the brachial artery as it passes through the deep portions of the upper arm. That's one of the bad things about these 2D diagrams in your textbook. You don't really get the three-dimensionality all that well with where these arteries are located. The arteries that we're focusing in on are larger, deeper blood vessels for the most part, and not the ones that are more superficial that would be bringing blood to these superficial portions of muscles and or to the skin. And again, all right, so blood is passing through the brachial artery, but depending on where it's going to go, which tissue location it's randomly going to head to supply oxygen and nutrients, it could be taking detours off of all these smaller arteries that you see, and we're just not going to worry about all those little smaller arteries. Okay, the brachial artery has two major branches for the forearm, and one is the radial artery, which is over on the, which side of the forearm is the radius bone on? Lateral. Hopefully you guys remember your lateral and your medial, and hopefully you also remember anatomical position. You know, so the forearm is always oriented such that the thumb is toward the outside of the body, and that's where your radius bone is located, over there on the thumb side, when the forearm is rotated that way. On the medial side, you have the ulna bone, and there is a deep, large artery that runs along the ulna bone, and that is called the ulnar artery. Okay, so you have that over on the left and the right side, and those are actually all of the arm arteries you have to know. Now let's say in a blood drop tracing activity, I say trace a drop of blood over to the medial portion of the right forearm. Okay, so that you know that blood is going to get pumped into the ascending aorta out of the heart. If we're going to the right side, remember you have the brachiocephalic artery, which your textbook is also calling the brachiocephalic trunk, and that's fine. If you're going to the arm, that's going to lead to the subclavian artery. That blood's going to continue to flow into the axillary artery. The axillary artery changes names again as we move through the upper part of the arm. It's the brachial artery. And then since we're going to the medial side of the right forearm, we would say it is passing through the ulnar artery. I'm not going to give you a super specific, anything more specific than that. So if we're on the medial side of the right forearm, at that point we'll just say it's going to, yes, we know that it's going through some smaller arteries that take the blood to specific locations on the medial side of the forearm. We're going to ignore those. We'll just say that the blood is passing through arterioles, capillaries, and venules of the medial right forearm, and then it's going to wind up entering the veins that will take it back to the heart. Okay, and what are those veins? We can see those here, the major veins of the arm. Now, lucky for us, most of the important veins, they run in parallel next to the arteries that we're learning about, and the names are identical. So it's actually not all that too hard. So if we're down here in the forearm, for example, if we're over on the medial side, we'll say that the blood is going to re-enter the ulnar vein. If we're over on the lateral side, we'll say that it's going to enter the radial vein. Those are deeper veins. If you look really closely at this diagram, in your textbook, the ulnar and the radial veins are shaded in lighter blue. You have to look really closely to see that, like right in there, for example. That's because they're deeper. They're running alongside those bones. The ones that you see in darker blue here on the diagram, like the basilic vein, for example, the cephalic vein, those are superficial veins that deliver or receiving blood, deoxygenated blood that is draining off of more superficial type tissues. Okay, so we're going to continue our journey back from the forearm. The radial vein and the ulnar vein merge together and become the brachial vein. There's that one, which is this deeper vein right in here that's running up the upper arm. And guess what? The brachial vein becomes what vein as we approach the armpit? It's going to change names. It becomes the axillary vein at the armpit, right in there. Then it becomes the right subclavian vein. Do use your right and your left always when you are naming these blood vessels. That's very important. The right subclavian vein leads to the right brachiocephalic vein, which is right in there. You may need to look in your textbook at these figures so you can see them more clearly. The right brachiocephalic vein is going to lead to the big vein that is going to connect into the right atrium. So what is that? We've learned before that is the superior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood coming from the arms, the shoulders, the neck, the head, drains into the superior vena cava. And from there, then we are back in the right atrium. So that's really all there is to it with tracing a drop of blood to the arms. You just have to know those major blood vessels. A big difference, though, and write this down, for veins, you do have a right subclavian vein and a left. You have a right and a left subclavian vein. That's not true for arteries. For arteries over on the left-hand side, there is no, I'm sorry, not subclavian, brachiocephalic. Scratch all that. I have not had enough coffee this morning, obviously. Scratch all that. You do have a right and a left brachiocephalic vein. Now, what did we say about the arteries? With the arteries, you have a right brachiocephalic artery, which sometimes is just called the brachiocephalic artery or the brachiocephalic trunk because you only have one on the right-hand side. On the left side, you don't have one of those. The blood comes out of the aortic arch and exits either into the left common carotid if it's going up towards the head, or into the left subclavian artery if it's going to head towards the shoulders, the armpits, and the left arm. So you only have a right just about did it again. Brachiocephalic artery. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. You got that little quirk there. You have right and left subclavians for arteries and veins. All right, how about some practice here? Let's practice one of these blood drop tracings so that you can see an example. All right, suppose you had this, this question. Trace a drop of blood from the right atrium to the lateral side of the right forearm and back to the right atrium. So this is what a lot of these will look like. All right, so we're starting in the right atrium. That's going to be the first thing you would write down. Include your valves. Include the heart valves that you've learned. So it's going to have to pass through the tricuspid valve from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. And then what are we going to pass through? What valve are we going to pass from the right ventricle as it exits there? The pulmonic semilunar valve or pulmonary semilunar valve, like you've learned about before. And then where are we? We're in the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk leads to right or left, the right or left pulmonary artery. Remember, those are the big arteries that are going to head to the right or the left lung. Okay, and if we have an imaginary blood drop, you know, we don't know whether that one's going to the right or the left. It could go to either one of those, so that's fine. Those major arteries, yes, they branch into smaller pulmonary arteries and smaller ones that are going to carry a particular drop of blood to a very specific lung location. You know, we're not going to worry about all of those. We'll just say right or left pulmonary artery, or arteries would be fine. Pulmonary arterioles will lead to pulmonary capillaries. Those are capillary beds that wrap around little tiny microscopic air sacs in the lungs. That's where the blood exchanges oxygen and carbon dioxide gases with the air in the lungs. Pulmonary capillaries then drain into pulmonary venules. The pulmonary venules lead it to right or left pulmonary veins, depending on which particular lung our little blood drop happened to go to. The pulmonary veins lead back to the left atrium. So our oxygenated blood then passes the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. All right, and then we're going to pass the aortic semilunar valve. And we're in the first part of the aorta now. That's called the ascending aorta. That's the part that's moving upward. So with your blood drop tracing, learn this first. This is the pulmonary circuit, and this is going to be common to any blood drop tracing that we do. Now, on the actual test, I'm going to give you more than one blood drop tracing to do, and I will tell you, you know, just write out the whole pulmonary circuit for the first one that you do, and then you don't have to do it for the rest of them. But practice with this. You need to learn, if you don't already know the pulmonary circuit, you need to learn that sooner rather than later. Okay, so we're going over to the right forearm. We're going to enter the aortic arch, just kind of sort of, because this blood drop, it's going to the right side. It's actually going to exit off the aortic arch pretty quickly into the right brachiocephalic artery. Yes, it is fine if you just say brachiocephalic artery, or your textbook calls this the brachiocephalic trunk. That's fine. It's called a trunk because it quickly, it's like the trunk of a tree. It's very quickly going to split off into two branches. We're going to the arm, so the blood is going to have to head off into the right subclavian artery. That's going to become the right axillary artery. It's not exiting because it's going to continue on down into the forearm. Then it's going to pass through the right brachial artery. It's a very deep artery. We're going to the lateral side, so the brachial artery is going to split into the ulnar and the radial arteries that are down deep in the forearm. Since we're going to the lateral side, this blood drop is going to pass through the right radial artery. Then it will enter forearm arterioles, forearm capillaries, and forearm venules. And yes, it is certainly true that in most cases, it is certainly true that any blood drop is really going to pass through some smaller arteries before it enters any forearm arterioles, but we're not going to worry about those minor arteries that it would be passing through. Okay, the deoxygenated blood that is going to leave our forearm and head back to the heart will then enter the right radial vein, the right brachial vein, the right axillary vein, the right subclavian vein. So all of this is just the same in reverse. Right brachiocephalic vein, that enters into the superior vena cava. And then finally, we're back in the right atrium. So there's your whole blood drop tracing. Starting in the right atrium, going to the lateral side of the right forearm, and then back to the right atrium. So you just have to learn how these arteries are interconnected with each other, and the veins as well, and just keep in mind it's a one-way blood flow. Okay, I want to return back over here to the diagram showing the major veins of the arms as well, because there are a couple of other veins on here that I want you guys to be aware of in terms of their identities. One of these is the cephalic vein. The cephalic vein runs along the lateral. This is a superficial vein. So it's close to the surface. It runs along the lateral side of the forearm, and then it also runs along the superficial portion of the anterior part of the upper arm as well. And notice, if you keep following it, it winds up connecting over into the, it merges in with the subclavian vein up here in the shoulder. So in reality, if you have deoxygenated blood that's draining off of superficial tissues over on the lateral side of the forearm or the anterior side of the upper arm, a lot of that blood winds up in this cephalic vein. That's also the, people who are very lean and muscular, you see the vein that's kind of bulging off of the, through the skin on the anterior side of the upper arm. That is the cephalic vein. That's what you're actually seeing there. So I wanted to point that one out to you. And another one I want you guys to be familiar with is this median cubital vein. That's one that crosses the anterior side of the elbow, and that is the one that usually gets stuck for blood draws, over there on the anterior side of the elbow. And I think we have all experienced that one before. Another one, there's a superficial vein over on the medial side. That is called the basilic vein. So that's going to be over on the inside of the arm. Superficial, so it's draining deoxygenated blood off of superficial tissues, and then if you look really carefully, it's going to merge up here into the axillary vein, which will then connect into the subclavian vein as well. I want you guys to be familiar with those three superficial veins of the arm, and yes, you do have them on the left and the right-hand side. They're not going to be part of our blood drop tracings. Okay, but I just want you to be aware of those three veins as well. Not part of the blood drop tracings. Don't use those for blood drops. I won't give you any that involve those particular veins. Any blood drop tracings that involve the arms, you can assume we're going to use the deeper veins that we have been talking about. All right, that concludes this particular video on doing blood drop tracings to the arms. And the next one will be about, what do you do when a drop of blood is headed toward the head? That'll be the subject of the next video lecture.